Hello and welcome to the Friday afternoon talk series. This one is called Sea Limits, Red Lines, Grey Zones, and Deterrence in the South China Sea. We are familiar with how Beijing has been gradually yet persistently eroding the foundation of the international legal order and chipping away at international resolve to safeguard the same. In the maritime space, based on the strength of what the country terms its historical rights, China has been engaged in a long term project at consolidating its presence and hold over the rocks, reefs, and islands which, per the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, are beyond its jurisdiction. Towards this end, Beijing has employed an assortment of grey zone tactics for enforcing its sovereignty claims in the South China Sea. In this panel discussion, we will discuss the significance and utility of a rules based order, the strengthening of responses among South China Sea littorals, the Taiwan-China-US dynamic, how the South China Sea is one of the most vital areas of potential conflict, and how and the potential, of course, of political incentives that can be offered to China by regional and international order so that it can be deterred from continuing its unilateral activities. Additionally, we would also look at how the South China Sea issue impacts geopolitics of the larger Indo-Pacific region. Joining us in the panel today are Evan A. Lakshmana, Senior Research Fellow at the Center on Asia and Globalization, Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, National University of Singapore. We have Ms. Tingting Liu, former foreign affairs and who is a foreign affairs and military correspondent with TVBS News, one of the largest broadcast news stations in Taiwan. Ms. Pham, who has been covering Southeast Asia and in particular Vietnam and the South China Sea for the AFP, the BBC, and now also the RFA for almost 20 years. And we have Commander Abhijit Singh, a former naval officer and a senior fellow and who heads the Maritime Policy Initiative currently at the Observer Research Foundation. A very warm welcome to you all. Let me start with the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken's visit to Southeast Asia, which comes in the wake of an increased frequency of US engagement with the Indo-Pacific, especially in the last 6 months or so, which has involved visits to Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and along with meetings with other ASEAN members. It was reported just before Blinken's visit that the US plans to take engagement with the 10-member ASEAN to unprecedented levels, while the Chinese state-owned Global Times, quite unsurprisingly, said that Blinken's visit failed to change any equilibrium in the Southeast Asian region. Now, ASEAN centrality is vital for geopolitical engagements in the Indo-Pacific, as also the South China Sea, as ASEAN members are littorals of the latter. I will start with you, Evan. How do you see the narrative of supporting the central role of the ASEAN in the region being translated in reality into actionable measures?
Thank you, and thanks for having me. First of all, ASEAN centrality is viewed and interpreted differently by ASEAN members and by its dialogue partners. Its dialogue partners tend to view ASEAN centrality as this functional regional organization in terms of solving regional security problems, when in fact ASEAN members themselves see ASEAN centrality as about processes, about the ability to participate and convene meetings among its members as well as its dialogue partners. So this mismatch between a process-oriented and an outcome-oriented ASEAN centrality is why there is such frustrations from both sides. Southeast Asians feel that the US has not invested enough in strengthening ASEAN centrality through its participation in various ASEAN meetings. And on the other hand, the US and its allies and partners are also frustrated with the fact that ASEAN has not been able to deliver or solve key regional problems, whether it's the South China Sea or Myanmar. So at the heart of ASEAN centrality is a different interpretation about strategic vision of regional order and how we deal with pressing regional challenges.
I see. So, what you're saying is that this difference in perspective is prevalent among the Southeast Asian countries, as also among countries who are external to the region as to how to approach the issue.
Yeah, and I think one more factor that's relevant is that the US and others often conflate ASEAN as a regional grouping and Southeast Asian states individually. The act of engaging with different bilateral relationship with different ASEAN states is not equivalent with sustaining ASEAN centrality. When you look at the comparison of ASEAN's dialogue partners, the US, China, India, Russia, Australia, and others, the list of activities under a massive strategic blueprint between ASEAN and the US is actually quite underwhelming, especially compared to China. So this is, I think, a difficult question for every dialogue partner. Do you engage ASEAN as a regional grouping, knowing very well that you're investing in institutions that driven by process-oriented mechanisms, or do you engage with individual Southeast Asian countries that can deliver key but occasionally limited strategic benefits to you? And I think this is a question that not all dialogue partners have solved.
I see. Thank you. We have also seen how systematically China's Navy, Coast Guard, and Maritime Militia have also sought to block moves by regional countries to exploit resources within their exclusive economic zones. Oil exploration conducted by Vietnam, for instance, through various intimidation tactics. But while Southeast Asian countries have typically had to walk the tightrope of maintaining a balance between China and the US, and also between their security and economic interests vis-a-vis China, we do see that in the past 5 years or so, in particular, these countries have also been become increasingly vocal about transgressions. Ms. Gafam, this would be a question I would ask you. How do you feel? Do you feel actually that the strengthening of involvement by the US, Australia, Japan, and also the increasing presence of institutions like the EU and platforms like the Quad have helped to bolster the South China Sea littorals to take a firmer stand?
Um, I don't think that it's actually bolstering, as you said, the stance of South China Sea littorals, but I think that it highlights actually the division within ASEAN. So we really need to have another look at the so-called centrality of ASEAN, because the bloc actually has been very divisive over how to approach South China Sea disputes and how to deal with the different claims, because countries of ASEAN do have very different interests. And, even though the bloc actually has been operating based on the principle of consensus, but we can't see how that consensus actually is being translated into a common approach. So I think, the appearance, the presence of, say, AUKUS or increased activities of European Union and the United States in South China Sea actually highlights the difference between different countries approach in the South China Sea. We see countries like Malaysia and Indonesia have been quite muted about, quite critical about AUKUS, for example, while Vietnam and the Philippines probably are more welcoming. It comes from their basic interest in the South China Sea and how they look at the way to resolve the disputes there. So I've been covering Vietnam quite a lot, and the Vietnamese government has been very pragmatic in the way they see the disputes in the sea. So whatever comes to their economic interest, then the Vietnamese will react. And amongst the ASEAN countries, only Vietnam and the Philippines are more vocal. I think other countries have been very careful, very quiet, and try to basically, sort the problems behind the scenes more than go on international forums and speak out about that. So it's quite a big gap between countries' approach in the South China Sea issues.
Okay, that's interesting. And you do mention that Vietnam and Philippines have been more vocal. Why would you say that these two countries in particular have been more vocal? And you also mentioned that some other countries have tried to or sought to sort out their issues behind the scenes, maybe bilaterally with China. Do you think that those have gone well? Those have borne more fruit?
So when I say that the Vietnamese have been more vocal, I mean, the Vietnamese don't actually talk too much, but they act a lot. I mean, when it comes to their dealing with, say, Chinese aggression in the South China Sea, you've seen lots of clashes on the sea. Vietnamese Coast Guard also, involved firing water cannon onto Chinese ships, for example. And Vietnam has actually has been operating quite a large fleet of maritime militia as well, together with China. So they've been vocal in that way, in their actions against China's aggression in the sea. While the Philippines, because of their characteristics of their politics, in traditional Philippine way of dealing with, I mean, they always very eloquent and very vocal on international forums. They compared to other ASEAN countries, they speak better English. They go overseas and they join forums. They do deliver really excellent speeches about South China Sea, which the Vietnamese never do. So I think it's that way. They vocal in a different way. While Malaysia and in Indonesia, we don't see that. I mean, they've been quite kind of calm and sort of trying to keep it under the lid, should we say that, and trying to kind of negotiate more with other countries rather than go frontal.
I see. That does shed some light as to why there are different approaches among the South China Sea littoral countries. Coming to you, Ms. Liu, the US maintains a policy of strategic ambiguity towards Taiwan. But since the Trump administration, we have seen how US officials have become increasingly more outspoken and increasingly more willing to take a stand. And this is particularly relevant after the recent instances of China's naval presence in the Taiwan Strait, which is a territorial sea and with direct sovereign control under the UNCLOS. Do you believe that the US position on Taipei is assuming a clearer scope?
Hi, thank you for having me here on this forum. It's really good to share some of my perspective and reporting in Taiwan over the past 4 years. I was previously based in Singapore, so I covered a lot of ASEAN, but I was actually interested in cross-strait relations and I moved to Taipei. So with that said, I think within the past 2 years, it's actually a pivotal time for Taiwan in terms of cross-strait relations and also the US Taiwan-China issue. So we have seen that there's one thing that the Biden administration had not reversed much, and that's actually the policy and basically their policy on Taiwan. So what we see locally is that I believe if we talk about whether US is trying to maintain their strategic ambiguity or are they going to remove that completely, I think US themselves is still trying to toe the line, I guess. So in that sense, during the Trump administration, they towards the end of just before the election and just after their 2020 election, you can see like they have been very vocal for Taiwan, and with that, they actually gave US-Taiwan relations a lot of leeway and also maybe more maneuvering space for the incoming Biden administration. And we have seen that Biden actually did not much reverse Trump's policy on Taiwan. But with that said, we have seen that the PRC, the Chinese, has actually been very actively trying to, I would say, some people call it harassment, some people call it flexing muscles, around Taiwan, and there is no doubt. And then we have seen that the Taiwanese Defense Ministry have also been officially actively releasing these PLA incursions on a daily basis. So what the Defense Ministry in Taiwan do now is that they will actually release how many planes the PLA sent on a daily basis. So they actually copied this kind of format from the Japanese side. So what they do is that they talk about how this PLA aircraft fly into the Taiwan air defense zone. But let's talk about the Taiwanese air defense zones. Actually, what we call it a ADIZ, the Air Defense Identification Zone. So with that said, it's actually not the sovereign airspace of Taiwan. It's actually the zone that is actually drawn out. So technically it's actually international airspace, but it's just really, really close to Taiwan. And at the height, I think in October, if I'm not wrong, from the 1st of October to the 4th of October, the PLA actually sent a total of 150 aircrafts, and many of which is actually their jets, their fighter jets. And then no doubt actually sent a signal to the region. But it's really interesting that why the PLA sent so much aircraft during that period of time. You know, a lot of people actually say that, oh, it's because you know, October 1st is actually mainland China's National Day, so that's why they are doing this to flex the muscle. But during that period of time, it's actually, if not wrong, it's the US aircraft carrier and the UK aircraft carrier was actually traveling through the Pratnashree Strait region. So, you know, with more European powers and US powers transiting through the region, going through the China Sea and going on their other military activities, that also prompted the PLA aircraft to, you know, to fly in protest or should fly in practice. So, you know, there's a lot of attention on Taiwan. But sometimes you can see, like, for the PLA incursions, you know, whether it's targeted towards Taiwan or targeted towards other superpowers, you know, the line that I draw is actually we will use to determine that if there are other foreign powers in this region, and indeed there are actually more increase in tension in this region, trying to, you know, send more of their jets or more of their ships. So we have seen, like, no doubt there's more power play in especially the Taiwan Straits.
Right. So you mentioned that there is an increasing presence of foreign powers in the region, which is true because the Indo-Pacific is steadily attracting the presence of countries across the world who are seeking a greater role and in their participation in the region in different ways, through commerce, through political ties, through diplomatic ties, and so on, through the formation of many multilateral and trilateral, bilateral platforms. And so on. Do you think that this increased presence of foreign powers in the Indo-Pacific region also helps Taiwan's position?
No doubt it does, because the way I see it, like, you know, it's actually a question that when foreign media likes to ask me, you know, whether Taiwan is the most dangerous place on earth as quoted by the economists, or as to whether, you know, Taiwan should actually stay muted on its issues, or maybe there should be less attention on Taiwan because that may put Taiwan on a more dangerous position, because that will actually triggers the PRC, as you can see when recently when Taiwan and Nicaragua actually severed diplomatic ties, you know, so there's a lot of power play behind this. But the way I see it personally, and this how I tell many of our friends out there, is that, you know, Taiwan needs to be heard, and Taiwan needs to be people need to put their attention on the tension in Taiwan. You know, the cross-strait tension has always been there. It's been there for 70 years. It is just that, you know, there have been so many wars happening around the world, you know, be it the Korean War, the Vietnam War, Afghan, Iraq, blah, 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 that kind of thing. But, you know, it is just that so happened that we are at a period of time where the PRC, and no doubt their military presence is just only going to increase because they are a superpower, and there are increasing pressure within mainland China in hoping that they want to reunify with Taiwan, because, you know, it is in their DNA. You know, it is the line, it is a red line they hold very closely. So you can see, like, you know, the Chinese see the one China policy, you know, as their main line. So this is something they will actually be very unwilling to back down. But you know, back in Taiwan, you know, Taiwan is a democracy, and it is a functioning democracy. And as of, like, on December 18, you know, people have the referendum. You know, people can go to the polling stations with votes. So, you know, with that said, I'm a firm believer that the future of Taiwan should be decided by the people living on this island. You know, and that is not to say that, oh, you know, Taiwan should actually maybe pan towards US in hope for survival, or maybe, you know, should actually have maybe a real incursion or war with the mainland Chinese. And that is actually something I don't think people living on this Taiwan island would want to see. And, you know, I have spoken to many people, you know, because actually I have grown overseas, you know, coming back. So sometimes when I see the Taiwan issue, I see it from maybe a very outsider lens, while also trying to report from inside and within. And in that sense, I have actually seen that most Taiwanese wouldn't want a war, because that would actually be very detrimental to so many years of development that the government, that the people have put in. People here would hope to maintain the status quo, in a sense that, the economy, the defense, the infrastructure will remain the same. But if it comes to a period of time where Taiwanese need to choose, people in Taiwan will no doubt choose for their own sovereignty, choose the safest path that the people on this island would hope to. So with that said, I think the international orders need to realize that the Taiwan issue is not only a US-China kind of fight between these two superpowers, because the issue has been there, and the Taiwan issue concerned the 23.5 million people living on this island.
Right, of course. Coming to you, Commander Abhijit Singh, Beijing has set about methodically testing international response to its actions. For instance, it seized the Scarborough Shoal from the Philippines in 2012. It then deployed the Tianjin dredger to the Quarteron Reef and the Fiery Cross Reef, where the dredger stayed stationary without any activity for weeks at a time. And since then, we have witnessed the expansion of activities in the Johnson South Reef, Fiery Cross Reef, Mischief, and Subi Reefs. And with military buildings, port facilities, airstrips, logistical warehouses, and other installations, and also more recently with its Coast Guard law and the Maritime Militia, Beijing has considerably enhanced its ability to project strategic power across these waters. Do you see this situation of what is often termed as tolerance warfare, or a state just short of war, prevailing indefinitely?
Pratnashree, at the outset, let me say thanks for inviting me to this excellent panel discussion. In geopolitics, it's often said that where you stand determines actually what you see. And I'd agree with you that a lot of what the Chinese have been doing in past months in the South China Sea, particularly in Taiwan, but more so, I would say, in those islands in the Spratlys, in terms of reclamation, and in the EEZs of the Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, some of the other countries, is really worrisome. But from an Indian standpoint, this is basically classical great power politics playing out in the South China Sea. There is little doubt about the fact that these issues of the South China Sea are important to the players in the region, the states in the region. But the fact also is that the Chinese are trying to make a statement to the US, which is seen as really the dominant power in the region. The Chinese contest that narrative that the US and its allies can actually push back China. And I think in some ways there is this sort of struggle for supremacy that's playing out between these two big powers in the region, notwithstanding all of the comments that some of my other colleagues on the panel have made, that this is not just about US and China, it's much more than that. But from an Indian standpoint, it does look like this is a clash of ego and ambition between US and between Washington and Beijing. But I'd say one thing, that India so far hasn't really sort of made any clear statement on what it makes of what's happening in the South China Sea. And that to me says something. That tells me that even though India is willing to signal to the world that it's sort of off the geopolitical fence, it's now beginning to empathize with some of the concerns that the regional states have in the region. But really, we are sticking to our old policy. We are still a bit wary of what happens in the South China Sea. One, it's a secondary area of interest. It's marginal to Indian interests. That's still the thinking in India, despite the fact that there's growing trade now that happens, that growing trade flowing across the Malacca from west to east. Despite all of that, there is this wariness, and I would put this down to two things. One is that there is this unsaid, unspoken pact understanding with Beijing that we will not step in a region that is politically sensitive for China if they agree to do so in our backwaters, which is the Indian Ocean, which is South Asia. And somehow there is the sense after the Galwan incident, the clash in Ladakh, that we've got to somehow not provoke China much more than what it already is, because that might lead to consequences on the border. Um, and second is also that that somehow there is this sense that if India plays up the South China Sea matter too much, it will be drawn into the Pacific, and it doesn't have the resources to be in the Pacific. It doesn't even have the political willingness to play a larger role in security in the Pacific, and therefore all of these discussions, even within the Quad and on the Indo-Pacific, that India does not want to polarize these arrangements and doesn't want to be seen to be part of a China containment narrative. But as an analyst, I have to say that I am not very sort of moved by some of these arguments. I still think that it's important for India to take a stand on what's happening in the South China Sea. And you mentioned a number of things that have happened. I don't think it's going to lead to war, but the reason we need to take a stand on it is because this is a political flashpoint for the region at large. And now that India has made its ambitions clear to sit on the global high table, I think it is incumbent to take a stand on matters of maritime principle. And for all of what your other panelists have pointed out, I think there is a real case for India to speak in a louder voice on what's happening in the region. But again, to get back to your question and to answer it briefly, simply to say that I don't think it's going to lead to any kind of long-term conflict, because I still believe that a lot of these countries are really sensible. I just think that this is gamesmanship, this is brinkmanship that is playing out, and we've got to let it run the course.
Okay, great. It's very interesting that you mentioned the Galwan clash, and also the fact, also elaborated on on India's position. India has sort of refrained from commenting anything regarding the sovereignty issue in the South China Sea. That's true, but we did see how in the Galwan clash, just after it, in a couple of weeks or so, India had sent warships to the South China Sea, and commentators termed it as an instance of asymmetric warfare. So, do you see that India is trying to sort of leverage its maritime capabilities, which have increased in the last decade or so, in response to China's incursions on its northern borders? And do you see that that could be something that we would see more of, or is it, as you mentioned, that India, the South China Sea region is far away and it's not really suitable for our interests and our resources also to do so?
Well, Pratnashree, I would think that so that's to begin an interesting question, and I have been asked that question in the past. I think that deployment that happened in the South China Sea right after the Galwan clash was a planned deployment. It wasn't in real response to what the Chinese were doing in the border. I think the Indians desisted from making that connection and continue to do so between what's happening in the South China Sea and what's happening on the border in Ladakh and Arunachal, even though there is something to show that the salami slicing tactics that China has adopted in the South China Sea is exactly the plan on land on the border with India. This is exactly what they're trying to do in Ladakh. But I think we've desisted from making that connection, and the reason for that is that this problem that we face with China on the border is basically seen in a sovereignty clash between India and China. And the political class is unwilling to link that up with the problems of the Indo-Pacific. So I think what happened after Galwan was that briefly there was a shift in that we deployed ships. There was lots that came in the media about India wanting to strengthen our presence in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, do more surveillance activities, send more aircrafts into the region. But a couple of weeks after that incident, we were back to where we were, in the sense that the things had corrected back to normal. And after that, we've actually not quite deployed in the South China Sea. We've done exercises with our Quad partners in the Western Pacific, and there are some that make the case that we're now beginning to adopt a more robust stand against China. I personally don't think that is quite the case. I think that we are India is trying to show that it is an Indo-Pacific player, that it does send ships when it's needed to, warships into the Pacific, but that it is still unwilling to play a role in security in the South China Sea. And I think that's how it's going to remain. Because remember, as I said, the South China Sea for India is a strategic morass. It is quicksand that can draw India in, and whatever India does in that space can be spun, and it can be interpreted or misinterpreted by either China or some of our partners to somehow show that either we are doing too much or we are doing too little. So the political class is still going to be, in my opinion, extremely wary about doing too much in the South China Sea. And if you ask some of our partners from Indonesia, Malaysia, they would say perhaps that's the best thing for India to do, to not step into a volatile territory or sensitive territory like the South China Sea.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. My next question is to all of you. A more constructive approach to making China comply is to perhaps put in place deterrence measures while providing sufficient encouragement so that the country will eventually recognize the framework of international law and order. And one way of achieving this is perhaps through stronger and more dynamic institutional mechanisms. But additionally, what do you think are measures that could be undertaken which incentivize China to contribute constructively and to buy in to the global rules-based order? And do you think that this would at all be possible? I'll start with you, Evan.
Sure. I think we have to start with one paradox. I think that should be obvious from the conversation over the last half an hour, which is we now claim that we live in an era of the Indo-Pacific strategic dynamics, which means that we have to look at the region much wider, much more expansive, and how there's an integrated strategic link between South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Northeast Asia. And yet, on key issues of affairs, we try to decouple the issues, whether it's the Taiwan Strait, whether it's the South China Sea or the border. We try to decouple all of these issues at a time when US and China and their competitive dynamics is actually becoming a vortex that overrides these different strategic currents. So we live in a weird time for the region, I think. We claim to be at the Indo-Pacific era, and yet we try not to be within the Indo-Pacific era when it comes to key issues of importance. And this speaks, I think, to the challenge of engaging China. I think the notion that any country outside of China can get China to do anything is an illusion. The US has tried to get China to buy into the system and the values and socialize them. It has not worked, nor should we expect it to work. Any effort to get China to change its behavior would have to come from their own system and from their own domestic political situation. So what can we do outside of China? I think there are two fundamental questions that we have to address. Do we still rely on multilateral institutions provided by existing systems driven by ASEAN in the hopes that norms building and confidence building can open a pathway for pragmatic cooperation? Or do we start to develop a set of non-ASEAN options, whether it's through unilateral arrangements like the Quad and AUKUS, or do we stick to existing bilateral strategic partnerships, whether that's done in the defense realm or other issue areas? And I think this search for strategic options to deal with an ever-expanding region, on the other hand, China and its behavior that's detrimental to the region, I think is something that most of us in the region are still grappling with. I think some countries have been more willing to entertain the option to develop non-ASEAN options or non-multilateral options, and others like Indonesia still cling on to the faith that multilateral institutions can help socialize norms of good behavior and dialogue. And I don't think we have a clear answer on that one. But the point is, I think one can only go so far in terms of deterrence before it becomes a self-prophetic cycle, basically, because you kind of create the chain reaction action dynamics that eventually will lead to some form of miscalculation or a crisis that we're not sure how to get out of. So we are strapped for options, and trying to get China to change might be too difficult, but I think what the region is trying to do is to develop options in case that time comes, but we're not there yet.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Pham, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I just think that someone mentioned the word status quo. I think it's in the interest of all ASEAN countries now to actually maintain status quo and not really escalating any tension and change that position. I think there is a saying in Vietnamese that when water buffaloes fight, it's mosquitoes that get squashed. So smaller countries actually don't want to get there. And get wedged in between two superpowers in their fights, and I think that is the reason why ASEAN countries still haven't been able to achieve a code of conduct for the country's claimants in the South China Sea, because they don't want to go there. They don't want to change what's laying there in the South China Sea. Whatever they say, there's still the understanding that we want to keep it like now, so we could probably quietly explore the resources there by ourselves, and we don't want to get a third party, either the US or Russia or other countries than India, for example, to get involved, and that is, I think, is a common understanding amongst ASEAN countries, even if countries like Cambodia, for example, which is going to be the chairman of ASEAN next year, is quite keen to achieve a code of conduct under pressure from China. But I think there is a certain strong resistance from other ASEAN countries not to agree to whatever scenario and draft resolution that China and Cambodia is proposing. So my prediction is that the situation like now in the South China Sea is going to continue and going to probably escalate a little bit, but not too much, into the new year and throughout 2022 into the year after. And my understanding of the Taiwan situation as well is that it's not going to explode into a World War III or something, because it is a certain threat from China onto Taiwan, but also an opportunity for Taiwan to be heard and to be seen. As Tingting just said before, 10 years back, no one spoke about Taiwan. Now everyone's talking about Taiwan. So it's also a chance for Taiwan to be there on international arena, talking about their own problems and their own fears and concerns. And I think it's too much hassle and ado about ADIS, the air identification zone. A few years ago, China created that ADIS in the East China Sea. No one reacted. That was not a big problem. So they actually quit their threat to create the same thing over South China Sea. So why are we talking a lot about it now over Taiwan? It's just because Taiwan is so clever to seize that opportunity to bring it into the table, so everyone could look at it and talk about it.
Great, thank you. Miss Liu, how would you see this?
Thank you, Ms. Pham, for basically summarizing the Taiwan issue pretty on a very succinct, and it's a very excellent viewpoint. And this actually did point out what I was trying to point out during the part of my discussion. So the question is on whether China can actually confirm to institution mechanism, and whether but I think on the Taiwan issue, it's actually it's very difficult, and because China has always been claiming that Taiwan is a part of theirs, Taiwan is part of China, and on every single diplomatic agreement they have with every single country is that they need to adhere to the One China policy. So with that said, but I would say that COVID actually gave Taiwan pretty much a more convenient leeway and space to expand Taiwan's influence, and also the word Taiwan around the world, as people has been discussing pretty much. So I think one thing for Taiwan is very important is participation in the UN. Taiwan has been brought from the UN even as an observer status, let's say with the WHO. So with that said, China has always been barring Taiwan, even if Taiwan tries to participate as observer status at WHA. And previously they said that it was still allowed during the Ma Ying-jeou government, which is the previous PMT government. But under Tsai Ing-wen's government, China has basically practically bought Taiwan's participation in that sense. At the start of Tsai's government's, Taiwan has not been able to participate, and it was always been a very it's quite a sad moment for Taiwan, because it is always Taiwan's allies trying to voice out for Taiwan, telling the world that it's important to put Taiwan on the global stage so that Taiwan at least participates in the observer status. But after COVID happened, I think Taiwan is at a very interesting position when Taiwan was able to, to keep COVID out of these islands because of its previous experience from SARS, and at the same time contributing to the idea that Taiwan can help, donating masks, donating essential goods throughout the world. But with that said, Taiwan is still unable to participate in many global forums, be it like, let's say, let's not talk about the UN, but maybe a lot of other forums that is actually headed by the international institutions. And the recent Democracy Summit, when Taiwan is also invited as a participant, that obviously triggered a lot of criticism from the Chinese and so the Russian, trying to say that, it is the democracy that is defined by the United States. So with that said, but I would say it's not a total loss game for Taiwan, because Taiwan is trying to navigate other possibilities, especially with more relations with the European Union. And we can see in the recent spat between PRC and Lithuania. So with that said, we can see that Lithuania is trying to improve relations with Taiwan, and I think it is a very special case because Lithuania is the only country that, it's not the only country, but it's one of the main countries in the EU that decided that, I do not need to depend on China. But the issue is, how many countries share similar fate, or they have the similar dynamics as Lithuania to say that, I can do be friend with you, China, I can choose to make friends with others. And then so much so that basically the diplomatic officials within the Beijing embassy in Lithuania decided to leave, and they vacate the whole facility, I think just 2 days ago. So I think for Taiwan's participation in the international institution is very dependent on friends, be it like Japan, be it like EU, be it like Australia or the US. But to make the Chinese willing to back down and said, okay, maybe Taiwan can participate in something, that's totally impossible from Taiwan. Yes.
Right. True. Commander Singh, would you like to come in?
Yes. No, I'm actually enjoying this discussion very much, and I think a lot of what the panelists have had to say has really sort of illuminated some dark corners in my mind about what could be a strategy ahead. But look, here's what I feel. I think that China recognizes the limits of its power. And the reason I say that is that history tells us that a coercive military strategy doesn't work in the long run. You can't dominate a space simply by having a powerful military. That seems to be the Chinese plan for the moment. But in the long run, what it needs to do, I think it recognizes, is to win hearts and minds. And it tried doing that, at least in the Indian Ocean, through the Belt and Road Initiative. But it hasn't succeeded. There are a number of countries that are now sort of up in arms against what the Chinese are doing in this space. And I'm sure that a lot of countries within Southeast Asia itself have reservations about China's larger diplomatic strategy in that region. So I think that it's not important to push China away. I don't think it's important to win against China. I just think it's important to have to maintain a robust front so China does not win. And China will in time recognize that this kind of strategy in which it is using brute power and simply coercive means to dominate over the others is not going to succeed. But how does one maintain unity in the face of Chinese aggression is the question that we should all be looking at and trying to find answers to. And I think the key to what's happening in the South China Sea actually isn't outside. It is right there in the South China Sea. I think ASEAN's got to take the lead. They've got to get their act together. I agree with a lot of what Ivan says, that it's been very hard because there have been different perspectives, interpretations of, things like ASEAN, centrality, etc. But it is absolutely vital that ASEAN comes together, especially on those negotiations on the code of conduct, to ensure that China does not get its way, because China recognizes that beyond power, it will have to use other means to subdue ASEAN, and maintaining a united front is simply the way forward, I would say. Thanks.
Okay. My final question is also to all of you, and this is regarding maps, which are important weapons of China's three warfare strategy, which includes public opinion warfare, psychological warfare, and legal warfare. And it is therefore a major tool of China's grand strategy in the South China Sea as well. China's cultural products since the 1950s have already featured its excessive claims in the South China Sea. Now, recently, some episodes of a web series on Netflix called Pine Gap were removed after Philippines and Vietnam complained for the show depicting the 9-dash line in a map of the South China Sea. The problems encountered by Netflix are a reminder of how the 9-dash line has become an increasingly contentious sovereignty symbol. So as China moves forward with its goals of marking the centenary of the foundation of the PRC in 2049, do you think China's so-called strategic messaging would increase further? Let me go in reverse now. I will start with Commander Singh.
Well, I think, I think Pine Gap incident was, of course, played up in the media. And I think not quite for the right reasons, because the documentary is pretty interesting. The 9-dash line controversy, I'm not surprised that that controversy was highlighted. I think the fact is that China has for a long time maintained something that Ivan mentioned at the beginning of the session: strategic ambiguity. It has in some ways helped China maintain that sort of ambiguous posture where nobody really knows what it's saying about the South China Sea, whether it is claiming all of the seas and the islands within it, or it is simply claiming the islands and not the seas. It's very unclear, which is exactly the way China would like it to be. But I think that I would go back to what I said some time back, that the answers to these questions do not lie in forcing China to issue a clarification about what is its real stand in the South China Sea, because the Chinese are never going to do that. I think what's key is to be able to negotiate with China, not one-to-one, but as a group, and try and make sure that ASEAN can, as a single unit, draw some call it concessions out of China, or get China to say something clearly about what its approach to security in this region is going to be. But I think focusing too much on the sovereignty issue, not just for ASEAN and China, but even for India and China on the border in Ladakh, is not the way forward, because neither side is going to make any open concessions. If at all some concessions will be made, it is on what's your approach going to be to security, to economics, to diplomacy in the region. And that, I think, will come out in the code of conduct discussions that are going on, if ever they culminate into something concrete in the future.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Liu, what would your take be?
It is a very interesting question, because previously I actually covered DOC and ASEAN issues when I was back in Singapore. So I'll just touch briefly on how it was like for me back 4 years then. As in, we can see there's always been trying to champion ASEAN to talk about the issue of South China Sea as a group to the Chinese, but has subsequently failed and multiple times. And we have seen that the policy and the tactic the Chinese want to is that, it's actually a Chinese saying that they like to use, that, if, let's say, 10 brothers, they unite together like a bunch of chopsticks, it's very difficult to break. But the Chinese always hope to discuss the issue of South China Sea one-to-one individually with every country, and with that, one chopstick is very easy to break apart. So with that sense, we can see that the leverage of the Chinese government has on ASEAN is increasing, and no doubt, the Chinese have been telling, let's say, like Singapore, who has actually no claims in the South China Sea, to see that, you're not is facing more increasing difficulty to actually negotiate the South China Sea issue with the Chinese. So with that said, if we bring Taiwan into the picture, the South China Sea, yes, we do. So Taiwan, the Taiping Islands, actually ours, and the 9- is actually one of the old maps that is also from the Republic of China. There's a lot of discussions to say that they actually acknowledge the ROC government back then, and they still use an old map, and then there's a lot of very interesting debate as to whether that is legitimate. But with that said, I want to bring an issue and everyone's attention, the issue of Pratnashree Islands. So there's a lot of POA incursions within the area, and many of them actually flew of a gray zone, like prostrate issue. But what we fear in Taiwan, no doubt, is conflict and its calculation that may happen in the region. And currently, Taiwan has actually put Marines on that island, but it's no doubt still militarily incapable of defending itself. So one that we see that the Chinese may attack on Taiwan, not directly on the main island, but trying to cut Taiwan off from its access to Pratnashree Island, which is on the southeast of Taiwan, a few hundred kilometers away. And Taiwan would have very little time and space to be able to save that island off, and that may be used as a leverage, or basically as a bargaining chip to discuss the issue with Taiwan. So we can see that with increasing military action from the Chinese, be it in the Cross-Strait region, in the Pratnashree Strait, also the South China Sea, they are also no doubt showing their military might, and that is a concern for people in this region.
Thank you. Ms. Pham, how would you look at this?
Well, your question was about whether you will see increasing use of the map and the 9- line. Yes, there will be, we will see a lot of the map in all and sovereign messages from China in all the cultural products, and in movies, in everything. I mean, a few years ago, I even saw that the Chinese have the 9- line in their passports for their citizens go see, and they have that message in their passports. And they also spot their T-shirts and other garments with the 9- line. But I mean, it's not a big problem. I mean, China wants to propagate that message, and other countries can protest. Like in Vietnam, for example, they refuse to stamp the entry to Vietnam on the passport with 9- line. Instead, they issue a separate leaflet for the Chinese citizen using that kind of passport. So I mean, it's all the ways to deal with that. But when it comes to what you call ASEAN unity in dealing with that, then I think it's quite impossible to get a unity stance from ASEAN countries. I mean, Singapore and Cambodia, for example, they're not directly involved with the dispute, so they can say whatever, they can call for a common stance on that. But other countries that have a basic interest, that very, very big economic interest in the disputes, like the Philippines or Vietnam or Malaysia, it's so difficult. It's not easy to get into one common kind of unity concept. So it's very far, and it's almost impossible to reach, I think, in the next few years. So it will just stay like this. I mean, that is the best case scenario, that is not going to change to the worst.
True. Okay, thank you. How would you see this, Dr. Lakshmana?
So I think there's two different issues. One, I think on the messaging part that you mentioned, and the second on the COC itself. I think on the messaging part, some Chinese propaganda narrative actually does resonate with the region. For example, simplistic depictions of democracy of the U.S. and China actually is sort of easier understood by some political elites here in the region. But of course, other types of propaganda or pop culture warfare it will be less successful. But I take a slightly different view of that whole Pine Gap episode in the sense that fighting over pop culture is meaningless in the sense that it doesn't change the legal standing or positions of those disputes, number one. Number two, it allows the government to bypass the real difficult work of negotiating and being seen as working by solving a minor issue over pop culture material like a movie series. So it's all fine. Everybody gets riled up over pop culture material, but they change anything. It makes the government look like they're doing something without actually doing anything. So for me, it's kind of pointless to keep fighting over that. Second, on the COC, this is, I think, a good example to the previous question about socializing China. The success of the COC is actually that China has socialized us rather than us socializing China. China has successfully used the process of the COC over the last 20 years to basically buy time to change facts on the ground, or at sea as it were, and improve their own economic and military clout, drawing Southeast Asian countries to their supply chain, making us harder to fight back when the time comes. And now it's actually the reverse. China actually wants the COC, but they want a low quality one. And Southeast Asian states are the one that's pushing back because we don't want a low quality COC. So we would rather delay the COC process to have a better, higher quality one. So now it's being reversed. Now that China wants it, we don't want it because what China wants is a low quality one. So this is why I think when it comes to the COC and the South China Sea, what matters is not the process. What matters for UNCLOS purposes is actually to what extent can Southeast Asian claimants first clarify their own claims under UNCLOS. That hasn't been done. The maritime delimitation among Southeast Asian states themselves are far from complete. So this is harder, I think, to justify for the domestic audience in Southeast Asia to clarify your own claims under UNCLOS. It's easier to paint the bad picture of the South China Sea by pointing to China, by pointing to the weaknesses of the COC, when they themselves don't have the political will to actually clarify their own claims under UNCLOS. So for me, the key for the SC to move forward isn't in the COC. And we should bear in mind, the COC is not a dispute resolution mechanism. It is at best a tension management step. So the actual resolution of the South China Sea has to depend on the maritime delimitation talks themselves. And that will never happen until the Southeast Asian claimants actually clarify their own claims under UNCLOS. So I wouldn't put all of my eggs into the COC basket, but for different reasons other than its lack of effectiveness.
Okay, great. That's incredibly interesting, and it brings us to the end of our time today. Amid these many points of tension, my takeaway would be that the jury is still out on judging how far China's interests are legitimate and how far they must be accommodated, and where the line must be drawn. Many thanks to Evan Lakshmana, Tingting Liu, Pham, and Commander Abhijit Singh for being part of today's very engaging discussion. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you and good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If I
Thank you.
Thank you. If I can just take a moment here and remind you about a small bite that I requested in my email to you. So if you would want to send that to me at any time before December 30th, that would be fine. Just a minute or two is absolutely fine on your take on the challenges in the South China Sea.
So the South China Sea has, for a while, it's well known, existed really on the margins of Indian imagination. And that's because India does not see itself as playing a direct role in the disputes in the region and also maintains a posture of neutrality in that space. However, what's just happened over the past few months has shown that the South China Sea might emerge as a global flashpoint, especially the conflicts that are raging between the US and China with regard to what's happening in Taiwan, as also in Hong Kong, and Chinese militia activities in the wider littoral, draw attention to how volatile that space is beginning to become. From an Indian point of view, I would simply draw attention to the fact that China's military modernization and the manner in which China has been deploying ships and submarines, not just in the Western Pacific, but also in the wider Indian Ocean region, is directly linked to the issues that we now see in the South China Sea. In the future, if the Chinese have a greater grip over the islands in the Spratlys and the Paracels in the South China Sea, there is all likelihood that the PLA, which is the Chinese army, and really the Chinese Navy, are going to think of projecting power in the Indian Ocean region, and in some ways threaten Indian interests in that space. So going forward, it's going to be very critical for India to recognize that China's military modernization and its military activities and non-military activities in terms of survey ships, research ships, mining vessels, etc., both in the Western Pacific as well as in the Indian Ocean, are going to directly impact Indian stakes in Asia, in maritime Asia. Thank you.
Thank you, Commander Singh. Thank you so much. Ms. Liu, we can start with you.
The Taiwan issue has always been actively discussed partners around the world in the last 2 years, and there has been increasing attention on cross relations, and especially in US Taiwan-China issue. So coming from this, no doubt the people living on Taiwan to see more discussions, because that would ensure more attention and in turn of Taiwan's future. And we have seen that the Taiwanese government have been active trying to push for more attention on Taiwan around the world. And the Taiwan issue is a pretty complicated issue because it has been around for the past 70 years. It is just tension has not always been in this region, especially during the past 2 decades. So what have is that with the Chinese increasing military actions and also the military modernization by the PLA army, there has actually been more incursions around Taiwan, no doubt, to also to determination on the Taiwan issue. But with more global attention on Taiwan, that would actually be helping and assisting Taiwan and the people living on this island.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.